I think it does. It really comes down to two things. I mean, the first is inspections, as we talked about before. I think particularly within like a closed wall panel context, which is something we've experimented with a bit, it frequently falls into a regulatory gray area in terms of inspections. Here in Colorado, we have a very clear regulatory framework for volumetric modular. We have very clear regulatory framework for site inspections in each municipality. But if you're enclosing that panel in any kind of way, you're somewhere in between and it doesn't really fit. And so that's a real barrier. I think that is ultimately a solvable barrier. Here in Colorado, we've worked a lot with our, state factory housing group to sort of understand some of those barriers, limitations, how we might be able to address them as we try and potentially add more value to our components going forward. So I think that is solvable. I think the second piece really comes down to, back to, I think, our earlier conversation around trades and scope of work and handoffs and risk and all of that. There's, I think folks who've, a lot of what we're doing is inspired by, European offsite construction methods where you'll see really high levels of finish. You'll see panels with sort of MEP in the panels. You'll see, a lot more complexity coming out of the factory. I think that some of that could make sense if you were to just whiteboard it out, but it requires different scopes of work. It requires a negotiation between the builder, who's manufacturing and who's installing. If you're pre-wiring panels, you've got to negotiate with the electrical sub to say, hey, all this work's done in the factory, so give me a break of this amount of money. And that's hard to do. And so I think a lot of that comes down to, for us, our hypothesis there is that, the solution is being turnkey. The solution is owning the field labor as well. And for us, I think to the extent that over time we add more value in our factory, that will also correspond with us adding more value in the field, because it's just kind of a hard hurdle to get over otherwise.
Yeah. Isn't there also a distance factor as to how far you can take a panel before the windows break and the doors get wompy jawed?
Yes and no. I mean, as long as you're designing and engineering the right way. I mean, we have built hundreds at this point, and we have not had window get broken even when we shipped halfway across Colorado. And there's folks who are shipping pretty highly finished panels all across the country. So the bigger issue is less of trucking there. It's often more climate. There's been some very, very expensive mistakes folks have made in bringing product from like a Phoenix to the Pacific Northwest, where you've got such vastly different climate and the wood gets real wonky and weird on you. So I think the transportation piece is there's a barrier there, but it's yeah. I mean, the transportation piece really just comes down to trade-offs. Sometimes it makes sense to ship more air because you add more value. Sometimes it makes sense to ship less air and add more value on site.
Yeah, and just to jump in from the builder's perspective on what Jeff was sort of mentioning as far as the complications of taking the next step and putting MEPs into the panels and insulating them and even drywalling them. I mean, from the builder's perspective, I mean, one, what's the benefit, right? I mean, we don't want to do things just to do them, and so obviously alongside of that progression, there would need to be some benefit to the builder and to the end user. And I hate to keep bringing it back to cost, but that's usually the first place we look, right? The risks for us are also sort of, as Jeff pointed out, we as builders, I mean, we deal with it all the time as it is today. The finger pointing, this issue happened on site. Well, was it this trade or this trade? Whose responsibility was it? And so, yeah, there definitely would have to be a shift in scopes of work and contracting. And, the solution is either, have it very nailed down in contracts and try to figure it out that way with the electrical sub and the plumbing sub, which feels really muddy and messy. Or as Jeff mentioned, as panel companies get to the point where you're also providing those things. You're not just the framer, you're not just the window installer, you're not just the sider, but now you're doing mechanicals, you're doing, you know, insulation throughout the house. If you're willing to take all of that on from the builder's perspective, you know, you've sort of solved one of those really big. I mean, that's a really big concern from the builder's perspective, because we hate standing in the middle between our trades, trying to play judge and jury over who did what wrong and who's got to, you know, fork up financially, is where that conversation usually goes. So, you know, until if panel companies are ready to take that step, then I think that we can head down that path. But you know, from the builder's perspective, it's a real tough sell, you know, until we get to that point, I think.